Just yesterday, Russia launched one of the biggest airstrikes of the entire war against the Ukrainian capital Kyiv.
Last night, Russia launched a massive combined strike that lasted nearly 10 hours. 18 missiles, including ballistic ones, and around 400 attack drones were used. Nearly 200 of them were shods. This is a clear escalation of terror by Russia. Hundreds of shaheds every night, constant strikes, and massive attacks on Ukrainian cities.
One of the attacks lasted more than 10 hours. Just imagine spending over 10 hours under the constant fear that a missile or an explosive drone could hit you at any moment. Thousands of Ukrainians have had to spend 2 nights in bomb shelters, or even in the underground metro system, hiding from bombs. And even that wasn't enough to prevent at least 2 people from being killed and around 20 more from being injured. But that's not all. What if I told you things are actually even worse? You see, yesterday's strike was really just a continuation of an even bigger one the day before. We're talking about 2 straight days of massive attacks on Kyiv and other cities far from the front lines. A clear message from Putin. We're going to keep this bloodshed going no matter what. Be very careful with your next move. In total, over the course of these 2 days, the Russians launched around 1,200 drones and 30 missiles at Kyiv and other cities. Yes, you heard correctly. 1,200 drones, and nearly 750 of those were launched in a single night. It's the first time Russia has deployed that many suicide drones in such a short period of time. It's absolutely horrific, and without a doubt, criminal. Now, many of you are probably wondering, why now? Well, this piece of news might have something to do with it.
Another huge wave of drones hit Ukraine's capital before Russian foreign ministers meeting with Marco Rubio.
Moscow seems to be provoking the Trump administration with a blatant show of force, just days before the US Secretary of State is set to meet with Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov. The truth is, I'm not really sure what they're trying to achieve here. Maybe they want to project strength sitting down at the table with the Americans, though what they're really showing is something else entirely. It's criminal. But what they have accomplished with these latest attacks, at least for now, is that Trump is now paying even more attention to Ukraine and Zelensky. Take a look.
I'm not happy with Putin. I can tell you that much right now, because he's killing a lot of people. And a lot of them are his soldiers and their soldiers, mostly. And it's now up to 7,000 a week. And I'm not happy with Putin. We get a lot of bullshit thrown at us by Putin, for you want to know the truth. He's very nice all the time, but it turns out to be meaningless.
Trump seems to be fed up with Putin, and this is not the first time in recent weeks that he has expressed it openly. These statements you just heard are only 3 days old. And pay attention, this reaction from the US president is no longer just talk. It's starting to turn into action. Action on the Ukrainian battlefield. Take a look.
Trump administration resumes sending some weapons to Ukraine after Pentagon pause.
Suddenly, the United States has started unblocking, at least gradually, the delivery of weapons to Ukraine after the Pentagon, under Hegseth, had ordered a pause. That pause, announced last week, was supposedly to allow the Secretary of Defense to evaluate US weapon stockpiles and reassess military support for Ukraine. Well, now, Washington has resumed shipments of 155mm shells, Patriot interceptor missiles, and precision-guided rockets. In fact, Ukraine was especially concerned about the Patriot missile supplies, since these air defense systems are critical for intercepting Russia's ballistic missiles, like the ones launched in recent nights. And since that same Patriot ammunition played a key role in defending the US airbase attacked by Iran in Qatar last month, many feared it would be prioritized and withheld from Ukraine for longer. But that's not what happened. Trump announced this past Monday that the US will continue supplying weapons to Ukraine. Good news, all things considered. Now let's talk about something that may seem even more surprising. As you know, a few weeks ago, NATO approved, under pressure from Trump, a plan to raise military spending to 5% of GDP, combining both direct and indirect spending for all member countries. That target will almost certainly be impossible to meet, mainly because European defense industries are already overwhelmed and will struggle to handle the wave of orders coming their way. Still, it sends a very clear message. Even if it's not 5% or even 3.5%, NATO countries are going to spend more on defense. You'd think that would make Russia nervous and push them to ramp up their military budget even more, a budget that has already jumped a whopping 73% between 2022 and 2025 due to their criminal invasion of Ukraine. But quite the opposite has just happened. Russia has announced, for the first time since the war began, that it's reducing military spending. Listen for yourselves.
У нас вот и в следующем году, и через год, это на ближайшую трехлетку мы планируем, пока нет договоренности окончательно между Минобороны, Минфином, Минэкономразвития, но в целом все думают именно в этом направлении.
Surprised? Honestly, I wouldn't blame you. From their point of view, this news seems almost absurd. What country still actively at war would decide to cut its defense budget? Besides, we're not just talking about just any war, we're talking about a conflict that has already caused nearly 1 million casualties. That's why here on VisualPolitik we've been asking a few questions. Is Russia running out of money to sustain its invasion? Why is Putin cutting military spending just as NATO announces record high investments? Is the Russian dictator trying to play the victim card to rebuild his relationship with Trump? Well, we're going to break all of that down for you right now. So, let's get started. Talking about military spending in Russia means talking about a financial decision loaded with patriotism. For the Kremlin, defense investment isn't just a priority, it's a structural pillar of its state policy. After all, we're talking about a country that claims to be constantly under threat, even though it's the one invading others, and that suffers from a kind of strategic, even historical paranoia, the same kind that led to the invasion of Ukraine. But before diving into the heart of the issue, we need to clarify a few important points. First, we have to put Russia's defense budget into an international context. Why? Well, take a look. Although Russian military spending has skyrocketed following the invasion of Ukraine, accounting for 6.3% of GDP at the moment, in absolute numbers, we aren't looking at such crazy levels. In fact, for most of the 21st century, both China and the France-Germany-UK triangle combined have far exceeded Moscow's figures. The difference lies elsewhere. Russia has always spent far beyond its means. Whatever the Tucker Carlsons of the day tell you, Russia is not a rich nor an advanced country. Beyond the large cities, living conditions are more similar to those of any poor post-Soviet country, rather than those of any European country, even when it comes to basic things. Even when looking at GDP per capita adjusted for purchasing power, which is where Russia looks strongest, the numbers are still far below the average for developed countries. Yes, it is a militarily aggressive country, but its war machine has always been a budgetary burden that's hard to sustain. In other words, Russia is maintaining a military scale far beyond its actual means, and that's exactly where many believed its Achilles heel was back in February 2022. At the start of the invasion of Ukraine, and many of you will remember this, analysts said that a war of attrition against Moscow would be a stake right through the heart of its war economy, especially with sanctions in place. More sanctions, in fact, than Iran, North Korea, or even Syria. So everything pointed to the idea that Russia's economy simply wouldn't survive a long conflict. But then, the Kremlin surprised us. On this point, they really did. Despite plenty of warning signs in their economy, which still exist, Russia has kept functioning, more or less normally, over 3 years, without a full-blown or imminent collapse. But now, things might finally be starting to shift. And the recently announced cut to military spending for the next 3 years, which still hasn't been quantified, could be the first sign that Moscow is beginning to hit the brakes. And this brings up a big question. Where did Russia find the economic firepower to keep going all this time? And why is it starting to run out now? Well, let's get into that now. It's clear that Vladimir Putin runs the Russian state like his own personal fiefdom. And at the onset of the war, the National Treasury acted as if it were his private bank account. When the Tsar needed to cover astronomical expenses that were never part of the budget, he didn't hesitate to order his cabinet to tap into the nation's savings. That's if we can even call it tapping. What actually happened was more like looting. You see, since 2008, Russia has been setting aside excess energy revenues in a national wealth fund. This gave Moscow a way to project some economic strength, especially when it came to long-term issues like pensions, largely thanks to years of high oil and gas prices that kept the fund well fed. But here's the thing. Technically, the Russian government wasn't supposed to use that money however it pleased, and definitely not to fund a war where they are the invading force. And at this point, you can imagine the blow dealt by the new Tsar. Since the outset of the war, a significant portion of Russia's national wealth fund has been funneled into the war effort. We're talking about a fund that holds much of the country's savings from nearly 2 decades. And in just 3 years, bam, Putin goes and burns through around 40% of its capital. Yep, you heard that correctly. In fact, the fund's liquid assets, mainly yuan and gold, have been drastically reduced. Basically, Vladimir had to smash the piggy bank to keep financing the war. And now, the longer this drags on, the more obvious the problems become. And that's not even the whole story. Don't think the Kremlin just dipped into savings and kept everything else running smoothly. Moscow has also paid a heavy social cost, and this might just be another cliff Putin is desperate to avoid. And this might just be another cliff Putin is desperate to avoid. When it became clear that the war with Kyiv was going to drag on, Putin quickly crafted an epic narrative, or at least that was the intention. The idea of a Western Atlanticist aggression against Russia to justify to his people why they needed to keep sacrificing so much for so long. Do you remember? Clothing brands vanished from store shelves, fast food chains shutting down, symbols of growing isolation, and worse still, tens of thousands of families torn apart by the loss of sons, husbands, and fathers. Many accepted it with a mix of skepticism and resignation. After all, as long as the fighting stayed far from Moscow and St. Petersburg, the war felt distant. Meanwhile, Russia's war machine roared into high gear, and strangely enough, that gave the economy a push. The arms industry picked up the slack, and over the past 2 years, Russia's GDP even saw a rebound. Today, Russia boasts record low unemployment. But here comes the but. Wages are starting to falter, and so is the quality of jobs, and that is already a sore point. The war has become part of daily life. Yes, in the background of everyday Russian life, but not because of air raid sirens or shelling. Although what they do wake up to each morning is a different kind of noise, one that's almost just as unsettling. Take a look.
Russian banks fear debt crisis is coming as war strains economy. The military's demand for manpower intensified labor shortages, however, and helped drive a wage spiral that boosted the incomes of many Russians, but also fueled accelerating inflation to an annual peak of more than 10% in the overheating economy. Russia's officials keep contradicting Putin on war economy. A banking crisis in Russia looms because of growing defaults not yet reflected in official statistics, with problem loans possibly reaching 3.7 trillion rubles, $47.3 billion, or 1/5 of the banking system's capital.
Aside from burning through treasury funds like there's no tomorrow, the Russian central bank decided to crank open the money tap, a massive expansionary monetary policy to patch up budget holes left and right, and the result was as simple as it was brutal. Between 2022 and 2024, the total money supply doubled. Yes, that's right. Russia printed money like crazy until there was just as much cash in circulation as there had been before the war even began. Or as Javier Milei might put it, pure monetary depravity. And of course, this money printing party came with a price. Across the board inflation, economic unpredictability, a drop in domestic reinvestment, and a much weaker ruble. As you can imagine, this toxic mix has started to hit the most vulnerable sectors of the economy. Let's not forget, even before the war, Russia wasn't exactly a high-income powerhouse or a land of opportunity, so this kind of economic deterioration could soon push poverty and extreme hardship to unprecedented levels. But have no illusions, don't think for a second that this keeps the Kremlin up at night. After all, Putin doesn't rule for the love of his people, nor by willing millions of ballots at the polls. But one thing Moscow does understand very well, the last thing they need, in the middle of this war disaster, is to open up a second front at home. The war is no longer hitting only macroeconomic stats, it's hitting everyday Russians in the wallet. And to make matters worse, things are not looking good for Putin outside Russia either. Because on top of everything, there's another storm brewing, an energy market that's increasingly hostile to the Kremlin's expectations. Among all the sources of money Russia has managed to squeeze out during these years of war, one of the key pillars has been, unsurprisingly, keeping its energy business alive. The truth is, despite sanctions and Western pressure, Moscow pulled off something many thought impossible, replacing much of the lost European demand for oil with new clients, China, India, and Turkey. Now it's true that gas hasn't been nearly as successful, but here's the crucial detail. Yes, Russia managed to hold on to some of its energy exports, but not to its tax revenues. Put another way, it kept the barrels, but lost the cash. And that point is essential for understanding how Vladimir Putin's so-called friends have squeezed him dry. You see, Russia's energy exports to its new customers have relied on a literal ghost fleet of oil tankers, sailing under obscure flags to dodge Western financial controls. The problem, China and India aren't exactly running a charity. They've used Moscow's desperation to twist its arm and demand steep discounts on prices and shipping costs, citing the risks of dealing in such shady operations. And now, with the latest shifts in the global energy market, that whole arrangement is starting to look unsustainable. This year, oil and gas prices have been on a downward downward trend, especially after the hostilities between Israel and Iran came to an end. Many of you might remember how, in the middle of the conflict, the United States rushed to prevent a price surge by negotiating with OPEC. Well, everything now points to energy prices staying flat throughout 2025, and that's a major blow to the Kremlin's fiscal outlook.
Russia's oil and gas budget revenue falls by more than a third in May. Russia's finance ministry has also raised the 2025 budget deficit estimate to 1.7% of gross domestic product from 0.5%, after reducing the energy revenues forecast by 24% due to expectations of a prolonged period of low oil prices.
It's clear that 2025 has been a weak year for Russia's energy revenues, its last silver bullet to continue funding the war effort. At this point, it's easy to see how Putin is running out of cards to play. He's already burned through nearly half of Russia's sovereign wealth fund. The domestic economy is starting to crack, and even energy cash flow doesn't seem willing to cut him any slack this year. Given all this, it makes sense that Russia is considering cutting back on military spending, though not out of strategy, but simply because they might not have a choice, no matter how much Putin tries to spin it. Now, while these financial troubles are becoming a real headache for the Kremlin, that doesn't mean the war is anywhere near its end, or that we're about to see a Russian retreat. Quite the opposite, as you saw at the start of this video. In fact, Putin might actually be trying to flip the script to keep the offensive going. And yes, I know that sounds contradictory, but let me explain. Pay close attention.
Point of no return.
All of the Kremlin's economic context points to one thing. Russia will have to revise its military spending, whether it wants to or not. But here's the thing, Putin has a level of budget flexibility that democracies simply don't. Let's just say, not having to face the ballot box gives you a few extra options. And this brings us to several possible scenarios for the future of Russian defense spending, starting with a brutal cut to the social expenses within the defense sector. Since late last year, Russia's military budget for the next 2 years has started to see some serious cuts, though not directly on the battlefield. You see, the Ministry of Defense also runs a whole range of social services for its personnel, and those services are funded from the defense budget. We're talking about things like military hospitals, schools, academies, and universities, both for training officers and educating the children of military families. There are also housing programs, pensions, and aid for all the widows and orphans of fallen soldiers. All of this is what's often referred to as the social arm of the military. And well, I guess you can already see where this is heading. The budget lines tied to international cooperation, education, healthcare, and social security are the ones facing the biggest cuts, and that's just in nominal terms, with inflation running between 7 and 10%. The real cut to defense ministry's social spending is even deeper. So yes, Putin had already planned to scale back military spending, starting with anything that doesn't directly impact the battlefield. And now, after his announcement, many analysts believe that those items may suffer even more. Russia's strategy here is pretty clear. Tighten the budget for a low-cost war, even if that means a heavy social price, just to keep the pressure on Ukraine. And sadly, modern military technology makes that totally possible. Of course, now that we're deep into this numbers game of budgets and spending, Russia is trying to play the victim. Yeah, seriously. In fact, let the Tsar himself tell you about it.
Уменьшать расходы. Они планируют увеличивать. Так кто ведет себя агрессивно? Вот в этом же основа политики в сфере обороны и безопасности. Поэтому все эти их рассуждения по поводу того, что они собираются поднимать, пусть поднимают.
So at this point, we can say it. Yes, Russia's defense cuts might be real, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they'll have an immediate impact on the front lines in Ukraine. Putin's just trying to redesign his budget to sustain a low-cost war, buying time while hoping Kyiv runs out of gear. All of this is happening while pensions, daily life for Russian citizens, and even conditions for the troops continue to deteriorate just to keep his criminal invasion going. We'll see what these cuts actually lead to. And of course, as soon as there's more info, we'll be here on VisualPolitik to break it down for you. Now, it's your turn. Do you think this is a real shift in Russia's war economy, or are we finally seeing the first concrete signs of the Russian bear's financial weakness? Drop your thoughts in the comments. We want to hear from you. And of course, if you've enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to VisualPolitik if you have not already done so. As always, thank you so very much for watching. Take care, all the best. See you next time.